Welcome to the HC Commodities podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking critical minerals and zooming in on US policy over the last decade and the reactions around the world to that. Back in 2017, awareness was growing within the US government around the strategic vulnerabilities of not having a supply chain in many of the critical minerals that were required for defense, healthcare, and the new energy economies. How have various policies progressed or hindered the development of a domestic supply chain in the US and also the West? And what is the new Trump administration's approach to critical minerals? How is that impacting former efforts like the Inflation Reduction Act? And what does it mean for China, and what will China's response be? And just how close are we to experiencing an outright scarcity on these critical minerals in the US and the West, and what would that mean for our economies? Our guest is mining entrepreneur and former Deputy Director for Batteries and Critical Materials at the US Department of Energy, Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes. I also want to highlight we have an upcoming HC Commodities podcast live event. It's on Thursday, May 15th in London. As always, this will be a live panel followed by networking over cocktails and canapes, hosted by the International Trade and Forfeiting Association, ITFA. We have a panel discussing navigating volatility, trends and risks in commodity trade, with panelists Matthew Chamberlain, CEO of the LME, Kush Pochkanawala, Commodity Risk Director at Heineken, Marieke Frans, Managing Director at Tixis, Will Tully, Managing Director at Brown Brothers Harriman, and Stuart Lawson, Global Head at Aon Credit Solutions. Tickets are free, but are RSVP only and limited. If you have interest in attending, you can direct message me or email Anton Posner, ITFA America's Advisory Board member, at antonposner@mercuryresources.com. And I'll put his email in the show notes, and I hope to see you and other listeners there. As always, you can support the show by leaving a positive review on the platform you're listening on. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So we are discussing critical minerals. We're talking primarily about US policy towards them. And obviously that's a hot topic at the moment, and one that is very much at the forefront of the new Trump administration and tying up with obviously security. Before we get too far down the line, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Because I think it is sort of key for the story we're about to tell.
Yes. Who is this person? So first of all, thanks so much for having me today. So I'm Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes. My background is actually petroleum engineering, but back in 2017, took a little bit of a right-hand turn into critical minerals. At the time, it was an exceptionally random transition. Now, looking back, it's been really fortuitous to have kind of that decade-long view in critical minerals, which is basically from the inception of the term, right? So I moved to Perth and started a nickel mining company called Black Mountain Metals. I then did a metals and mining SPAC, which was called Metals Acquisition Corp. We bought an operating copper mine from Glencore in New South Wales for $1.1 billion. Took the full 2 years to close the deal, but we closed it and it trades pretty well. Ticker is MTAL, so metal without the E. I stayed on for 6 months post de-SPAC just to help make it a public company, help take it from a cash box to an operating public mining company. Think exceptionally highly of that team, and then transitioned into government. So in the last year, I was the US Deputy Director for Batteries and Critical Materials. I did $6 billion in grants, so specifically the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law 40207 grants for any policy wonks out there, and then $10 billion in tax credits. So Inflation Reduction Act 48C. I also stewarded 30D. So transitioned out in January and have been doing a bit of investing, a bit of consulting, but all at that intersection of critical minerals and national security, which, as we can all appreciate, is one of the hot topics today.
I guess we'll come up with some of the contrast between the Biden administration and the new Trump administration and your perception of the involvement there. But let's just talk for a moment critical minerals and rare earths, I guess, is one of the terms within that. And we were both discussing a recent podcast with having a blast on it, Odd Lots, and essentially kind of, this idea that they're not actually that rare. So what makes them a challenge, and also the other challenge around these are very low volume and in sort of the grand scheme of economies are relatively low in terms of overall investment and so. Can you just, I guess, help frame us what do we mean by critical minerals, and what are some of the challenges around them, but why do they surface in this strategic and security discussion?
Absolutely. I would love to do that. So first we'll talk kind of broadly critical minerals. Then I'd like to zoom in on a subset of critical minerals, which tends to capture the majority of the headlines, which is rare earth elements. Very similar problems across the board, some just more heightened from a national security standpoint. So, critical minerals, there is a list that came out of USGS in 2022 identifying 50 mineral commodities that are both vital to the US economy and national security, but they have challenges around supply risk, production concentration, and import reliance. Far and away of those 50 mineral commodities, the majority producer, and I'm talking, upwards of 70%, sometimes upwards of 90%, depending on which of the 50 we're referencing, China controls. And so you kind of need to look at critical minerals in three chunks. One is upstream, that's the actual mining and concentrating of the thing. The second chunk is the midstream, so taking that concentrate and refining it, either separating its component pieces, metallizing it, like what needs to be done in order for that material to be used by the downstream. And the third chunk is the downstream. So if you're talking about battery materials, that would be your lithium ion battery manufacturers. If you're talking about rare earths, that would be your permanent magnet manufacturers. Now, why it's important to look at these different pieces is because the US really doesn't have much of any of the three of the segments. And this is really where you see the contrast between the Trump approach and the Biden approach. I do view critical minerals as being extremely bipartisan, and am very encouraged by both sides focusing on this issue that, again, we are almost fully reliant on our number one geopolitical rival to supply us with these strategic materials. And that is a problem for the US because Biden's focus was more oriented toward battery materials. So think your lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and specifically focused on building out midstream and downstream applications and friendshoring mining. The Trump perspective, the focus is very heavily weighted towards the upstream, removing barriers to permitting, unlocking federal lands. But the reality here is that all three of these segments need to be stood up in parallel in order to have a secure US supply chain. And so if you look at the challenge with setting those pieces of the supply chain up, it's really twofold. One is pricing. These are not broadly exchange traded commodities. They're generally traded on a spot market, generally in China, fully bilateral deals, very opaque and subject to manipulation on pricing. And second is offtake. So it's very hard to build an upstream or a midstream facility when you don't actually have that downstream demand to be buying your product. And so because of those two challenges, private capital, quite simply, is not flowing into the space as quickly or in the volumes that we need it to. And so it points a lot towards policy.
I get that, right? And lots of these minerals, some of them are genuinely rare, others are quite prevalent, but obviously you need that mining capability, but then you need those other pieces of the supply chain, the value chain, to be actually make that even somewhat economic, right? And ultimately that means you've got to have the battery plant or whatever it might be in your jurisdiction. But the one bit you didn't mention there was, it seems as well, and we've covered this narrative, this story on the podcast a fair bit about, obviously, many of these industrial processes, the mining was offshored by Europe because it's particularly dirty.
Yep.
You're having to dig up large volumes to get small quantities. The processing itself is very challenging. And over the last 30 years, China's built up, in particular China, has built up an IP capability that is now sort of vastly beyond the knowledge base within Europe and the US to even go about processing. Is that a fair comment? And how does that play into that story?
I think that's a very fair comment, Paul. Particularly when you're looking at the midstream and downstream pieces of this chain, you're right. It is not an economics only challenge. It's, we don't have the IP in the Western world to make much of this equipment. Further, we don't have people who are trained in running these kinds of processes. And even more complicating, oftentimes the machines that are used in the processes to make these
Are
materials
manufactured.
are manufactured in China. And so it really is a whole of supply chain enormous challenge to try to tackle.
Two more questions. One would be, well, first one is, let's assume that there's all the policy will in the world and money is no object. How long, in general, does it take to develop this supply chain, roughly speaking?
Well, if you look at China, they've been investing in and subsidizing the supply chain for 30 plus years. I think the track record in the US, although hopefully, that improves with permitting reform, is 20 plus years to get a new mine built. If you look at kind of the midstream and downstream, you could build those facilities in kind of 3 to 5 years, but that's assuming you already have the technology developed, the engineering studies completed, and you're going into kind of that final cap raise to build the thing and commission it. So it is not overnight.
It's certainly not overnight, right? Which is one of the inherent problems I guess we're going to come on to. Second question, just to get it out there, is these critical minerals go into essentially the modern, all technologies of the modern world. Yes, they're vital for the energy transition, particularly about battery technologies, turbines, and so forth. They also have a key component in defense, right? Especially, I guess, we start thinking about permanent magnets, to the point at which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the F-35 is the first US warplane that actually has a component, one component that's not even manufactured in the US in terms of
Yes.
particular magnets. So the lens spans across kind of all of the worries and flashpoints of the modern economy, from the energy transition right the way through a world that's somewhat shattering and now much more focused on security.
Exactly right, Paul. Even further than just permanent magnets, things that go into our weapon systems, kind of hardening agents. These are all reliant on critical materials, not just rare earths, in order to fuel our US military. And I think that's the framing that certainly gets Washington the most motivated to try to develop Western supply chains.
Reactions cause reactions, right? And I guess we'll come on to that. But let's start you mentioned 2017 and the world starting to become aware of this term critical minerals. There's the starts of presentations to Congress about the challenge of this. A lot of it's around lithium. So can you take us back to 2017, the first Trump administration? How did the critical minerals story evolve, and how did that translate into policy?
So back in 2017, the investment thesis was very nascent. Tesla was still the most shorted stock in the world. EVs were really not seen out on the road as much. And I think there was just a tremendous amount of reticence around why do we need these materials? Why can't we only have, oil and gas, which we are very good at, and just, let this thematic kind of pass us by. I think as time has gone on, and we can talk through the policy space, but really folks have determined that it's more of an all of the above strategy is needed, particularly through the defense lens and needing to develop those technology capabilities within the Western world. Under the first Trump administration, there was a focus on, trying to ensure that many of these materials were made in America, specifically with a focus on the upstream. So, starting to permit mines, really thinking through what materials would be needed going forward. I think what you saw with the transition into the Biden administration was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, which, as we all know, were significant buckets of taxpayer capital for a variety of purposes. I will only focus on critical minerals and batteries today because, frankly, I'll give you the wrong information if I, if I talk about anything else. But within those buckets, it was kind of twofold. It was one, trying to get private capital off the sidelines by lowering that CapEx threshold in the form of grants, tax credits, and low interest loans. And then, secondly, stimulating demand such that as we're building out the supply chain and trying to scale really large facilities, we will have the downstream industry there to support that supply, right? And that is 30D. So the 30D tax credit was the EV tax credit where half went to the OEM and the other half went to the consumer. And so that enabled kind of a push from the OEM side where maybe they're making less money or even losing money on EVs, but incentivizing them to continue manufacturing and climbing that scale curve to try to get to cost parity while also pushing consumers to buy those units. The reason that's important is in order to be competitive with China, even in the same world as China, you really need to be manufacturing at enormous scale. And you also need to have some sort of vertical integration such that costs kind of flow through the supply chain as opposed to chopping up the supply chain into multiple pieces and expecting each piece to attract capital, to have sufficient returns, et cetera. And so that's what you saw in the Biden admin was that focus on midstream, downstream, as well as fueling demand. Now, in Trump's second administration, to be fair, I think it's too early to truly say kind of what the policy will be. I know there's a lot of work going on in Washington trying to design mechanisms to bridge many of these challenges, which I think is great. I think with this administration, the focus is much less on battery materials and much more on defense critical materials. So your rare earths, your antimonies, gallium, germanium, tungsten, bismuth, those types of materials that you often hear about less. They're much smaller markets, much more specialized, and all specifically oriented towards defense. The focus to date under the second Trump administration has been very upstream oriented with a real focus on loosening permitting, loosening regulations, unlocking federal lands, also mineral deals. We've seen a lot in the news about, a potential Ukraine mineral deal, a potential Greenland mineral deal, a potential Congo mineral deal. Over the weekend, there was stuff in the press around stockpiling seafloor nodules to try to address the need. So I think a tremendous amount of ideas in the space. And we really need to wait and see what happens during congressional reconciliation. I think we can expect that later this summer. and see where some of this policy takes us.
There's so much there. Just going back to sort of Trump 1 and the Biden administration, including obviously the IRA, what actually got done? Given again those time frames, but also this underlying challenge of these are ultimately small volumes of, and our low prices. The US imports some, I think that, around $170 million worth of critical minerals each year, I think is roughly correct. Was this policy, unlocking some regulation, some of the obviously the tax credits provided as well as the grants, did we actually start to see progress made on a nascent US critical minerals capability, or is it still very much sort of on the drawing board?
It's a great question. I think anyone who describes the US critical mineral supply chain as anything other than nascent is seriously misguided. There is a tremendous amount to be done. So if you look at kind of where things sit right now, there are projects that have received or will be receiving federal funding in the form of grants, tax credits, loans that potentially are in the process of being constructed or being scaled. It is not every piece of the supply chain. Although it sounds really like a sexy amount of money, 8 billion, $10 billion, this is really just a drop in the bucket in terms of the capital that needs to mobilize in order to fully build out the chain. And so what government attempted to do was, for specific strategic points within the supply chain, to buy down that demand risk, because companies are having to say, we believe that the battery demand will be high enough in the future that it can support this large facility that we're building. It has not materialized today. And so that was a tremendous amount of risk that they needed to underwrite. And so after these kind of first of a kind facility constructions within the US, I think you'll start to see some additional movement of private capital in the space. I do not believe that we will see a large movement of private capital, certainly today, because there's too much uncertainty around demand. There's too much uncertainty around where the government's going to land. We don't know if 30D lives or dies during reconciliation. And so that's what it's going to take in order to actually scale these supply chains. One of my other soapboxes is I fundamentally don't think that we can compete on a head to head basis with China by just building the exact same supply chain that they've built out. They will beat us on cost 10 times out of 10. The hinge point here is they don't need to make money, right? We need to make money on a quarterly basis. They can take decades long strategic views. And so, because these are non market actors, I do fundamentally believe that we need government structuring in order to make the space competitive, at least in the early days, to get private capital flowing. But to your original question, the space is absolutely nascent. And largely, we have a missing midstream. So, kind of that taking concentrate, making it into a metal that can then be used by downstream industry is largely missing in broadly the West.
Just want to circle back to China in 2 seconds, because I agree with you, right? Their capacity just to flood the market, and those critical minerals, those final products make it via other channels, to the US is, they're not going to be able to be stopped at the border in that sense, or at least they'll be going to products that will then be imported, tariffs, etc. Just going back to the IRA, the money that has been granted within that program that you oversaw, is any of that at risk, or is that now locked in law and the grants are going ahead? Just to understand that piece, because again, it's kind of a 2-year political volatility that overlays a 20-year program is part of the challenge here, alongside the economics, and then obviously China, it has its own actions it can do. But where do those grants sit?
Effectively, all money has been paused. So that's Department of Energy as well as Department of Defense. So the DPA Title III grants that have been issued have all been paused. So the Department of Energy grants fall under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The Department of Energy tax credits fall under the Inflation Reduction Act. I think directionally, it's very likely that the grants as well as 48C within the Inflation Reduction Act likely survive reconciliation. The reason being it's being seen as very politically unpopular for Congress to repeal these funds when they're directly leading to a tremendous amount of jobs within their districts. I think the one that is very likely to get cut is the Inflation Reduction Act 30D. So again, that is the tax credit that goes to OEMs and consumers for buying electric vehicles. It does not have the support that the other pieces have. And so I think we'll likely see a repeal. But the summary is absolutely every piece that has been put on the table could be subject to being pulled away later this summer. So that's why it's so important to pay attention to this reconciliation process that's on.
And then you mentioned there as well that there's sort of just trying to recreate what China has achieved in particularly the midstream piece is not only impossible to do economically, but also actually in reality as well. You know, we're not just talking about federal laws here. This is, we've got to go through state and county. The environmental impacts of actually starting to process some of this stuff in the US would face significant challenges. Has any effort gone into on the research side to think about how actually the West can achieve some level of independence by creating these things through other means, if you'd like?
Yes. So it's actually quite interesting, Paul. The Department of Energy used to be a largely research-oriented organization and focused on the things that you just referenced. So new technologies, kind of pre-pilot scale technologies that needed to be de-risked before going to private sector. With the passage of Bill and IRA, the DOE became an infrastructure investor, and the reorientation effectively happened overnight. Now, only half of the Department of Energy, it was under the Undersecretary for Infrastructure, was focused on this post-pilot scale project area. And I sat in that area of Department of Energy. There's another half of Department of Energy that effectively fulfills the legacy purpose, but the whole point of having the Department of Energy. And it's under the Undersecretary for Science and Innovation. Within that half of the Department of Energy, there were several, and there continue to be several ongoing, specifically better ways to process critical materials within the United States. And those sit in two offices, AMTO and FECM. Those funds have also been paused, and we will see kind of the fate of those projects, but seemingly they're quite bipartisan in nature.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global experts network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
As you sort of allude to, right, we've had coming up to almost a decade's worth of focus on this particular issue.
Yes.
And the worrying bit here in some senses is that the stripping out of deep expertise that has been built up, at the department level and whether that is a bit of an own goal, or will absolutely be an own goal with respect to this issue, as we try to move forward and achieve some level of independence, right?
Absolutely. I can certainly say with this last fork in the road offer, so OPM reached out to, Department of Energy workers and said, you can make a decision to take this severance and leave today, but get paid through, I think it was August, or you can stay, but you might get fired anyway, right? And so there was the original fork in the road, which I think was very highly publicized, that didn't have as strong of an uptake. There was another fork in the road that ended Friday at midnight. So, like, very, very recent. And I can tell you that every single person that I know within the department who had that really deep expertise that we want focused on this took the fork this time around. They said, like, look, I have a skill set that I can apply in industry. I can make more money. I won't be like denigrated for being a public servant. And I don't have all this risk around the prospect of getting axed. And I think that is, as you said, like a very real problem, because now not only have we really not done much in the last 10 years, like not moved the ball down the field a tremendous amount, we've done a lot of admiring the problem. But now those people that have that institutional knowledge around how we've thought about it, the avenues that didn't work, like really, like, what have we been doing? They're gone. And I think that's both really sad and doesn't bode well for our strategy.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, right, a lot of people were in government because of a sense of service, but also job security as well. And one of those is gone, and the other one is being denigrated. So whether we'll be able to recover these individuals back to the Department of Energy or wherever they are is another question. Okay, so I guess we're firmly in Trump 2.0. You've already mentioned that there is an emphasis, a focus on the upstream,
Yep.
and we're seeing, obviously, there's a Greenland story there, there's Congo. I guess without that midstream and downstream piece, without those capabilities in place, are they sort of more, I don't know, hate to sort of say it like this, but are they more for show or demonstrative, or are they actually going to move the needle, do you think?
So it's a really good question. So headline is, I think any progress is good progress within the supply chain. If you think about the upstream piece, 20, 30 years to bring a new mine online in the US is our current standing. We need to start today. We do need to start today on getting that piece of the supply chain scaled. However, once we get to the point where we need to finance the construction of these projects, they will simply become another project on the shelf if we do not solve for the downstream offtake, right? And that's either building out downstream industry in the US or in the West to be an offtaker, or with this one is less popular for obvious reasons, but the US government effectively being an offtaker of last resort and stockpiling that material or using it for its own purposes. But to be clear, the volume of US government needs are not that high. And like that's the option set, right?
Yeah, it just, in sort of your economics 101, the supply chain is extraordinarily well set up, right? We've got one country that produces lots because it can, it accepts the environmental damage, and has created a world's cheap supply chain, but we're now absent that in a new world order, and the distortions that come in, as you say, and actually the challenge around critical minerals are just the volumes aren't there by one single country, even with determined purpose, to actually make any of this stuff economically viable. So this is all sort of from the US perspective, and it's kind of slightly depressing that sort of
I
know. We've done a great job of looking at the problem,
yes,
as opposed to actually move anything forwards. And of course, we don't want to get into it here. We've covered it recently on the podcast, but this thing is done much more effectively with partners, with Canada in particular, with Europe. So you can achieve some of those scales to build a supply chain that is economical, but that again seems undermined by the current tension between the US and its long-standing allies. But this all is somewhat assuming the absence of China here. China can do one or two things. One is obviously continue to flood the market to try and kill off any nascent startups. Secondly, it can stop exporting, which it has already started putting various critical minerals, particularly those tied to defence, putting export controls on them. Now, we reference Javier Blas and sort of just poo-pooing this a little bit about it might just make our vacuum cleaners more expensive.
Oh, I know.
but that is, I mean, that's a big stick, right, that can be wielded. And I would think, from all of my conversation, quite a consequential one as it plays out over time.
Completely agree. I think certainly export bans kind of make the pricing floor argument scarcity. You're competing against not being able to have the material. And so I do think it makes off-takers much more open to having the price floor conversation, which is, again, what is needed to get projects financed and get projects up. On being able to flood the market, so like inverse of scarcity, I think that's a much more dangerous approach for us because it's what's happened over the last 2 decades is we've been lulled into a false sense of security by having cheap goods delivered to us that we didn't have to worry about, and ultimately we let effectively all of our industrial base go offshore and we're left with no expertise, right? And so I think export bans, whilst much more painful in the short term, will spur action. I think flooding the market, much scarier proposition. I argue government can counter it in two ways. One, very rigorous domestic or allied sourcing requirements. And two, very targeted tariffs, not the tariff situation that we have seen over the last couple of weeks, but tariffs specifically on critical minerals and the downstream goods manufactured by foreign entities of concern. So your non-market actors, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
And it's hard to do counterfactuals and hypothesize and so forth, but
Totally.
do you think the IRA as it stood, and bits of it may still survive that reconciliation process, was that a clearer signal to the market, to the West more broadly, about to build up a nascent supply chain? And essentially we've just introduced a whole sweeping set of uncertainties that does mean we stay in abeyance. I say the US stays in abeyance on this topic.
Hey, you're in the boat with us.
Yeah.
You're in the boat.
Citizen. Just for any listeners that think I'm detracting from the government.
So again, counterfactuals are hard. I think the reality is the more flip-flopping we do, whether it's IRA, whether it's no IRA, like whatever the policy landscape is, we need consistency, because if IRA gets repealed and something else, maybe even something better, replaces it, I don't know that it moves the needle much, because investors will be scared, and rightfully, that in 4 years there will be a new administration, and their investment framework will again get repealed and reworked. These are 30, 40-year life projects that you need to be able to underwrite with some sort of certainty around rule of law. And I'm not convinced that we have that today.
So coming back to that sort of the harder, at least short-term pain of a total export ban by China for a longer period of time, how long would that be, and how serious would those ramifications, would they be felt by us and how serious a challenge would that be if we did to see the trade war escalate to the point of a total ban on exports around all of these critical minerals that are, as you stated at the start, and some of them are 100%, supplied by China, tied up by China. So, what is that? What does that look like?
Yes, I think it's a very scary prospect. If we're looking at specifically a rare earth ban, it's most frightening in the situation of a global conflict because oftentimes, we see permanent magnets going into drones, going into weapon systems. In the civilian world, permanent magnets go into electric vehicles, go into wind turbines, go into electronics. If we have no rare earths and therefore no permanent magnets flowing into the country, there are some sources of alternative supply. Think like vacuum schmelz in Germany. They're also building a facility in South Carolina, but it's years away from production. We very quickly get into a situation where, yes, prices will go up and we will feel pain that way. But the more scary prospect is scarcity. Like we just quite simply will not have enough permanent magnets to go around. And so I think you get into a situation really quick where microchips and the auto supply chain during COVID, this one piece was holding up all of the supply chain from shipping vehicles. Like that's exactly what will happen to the broader electronics, energy, defense space in the event that we have zero access to this material. More broad critical mineral blockages. Again, it's a more broad impact. It's really across the board. Everything we touch and interact with now has a battery. It actually like shocks me the things that have batteries these
I know,
days,
I know.
like our suitcases. It's like
Yeah.
it's unbelievable. But you get into a situation really quickly where like we quite simply cannot meet demand. I think that scarcity absolutely drives action by both the private and public sector, but there'd be a tremendous amount of pain in the years long interim where we are scaling
I
capability.
mean, that is an extraordinary, powerful, as I said, a powerful stick. It's an incentive to continue cooperation with China, but it's a powerful position to be in, which obviously has somewhat been part of the plan. Where is China today on export controls? How real are they compared to that scenario you just outlined?
We're pretty much there. They've put in place export controls. And so materials can only be exported by special permit. These permits are not being issued. They've said, at least 90 days to start getting these special export permits, if at all, right? And so we're very quickly launched into extreme scarcity, particularly on heavy rare earths. Heavy rare earths do not get enough airtime. Everybody lumps rare earths, critical minerals, everything together, but the heavy rare earths are 100% processed in China. There is no alternate processor. And these materials are required to harden permanent magnets. So for high temperature applications like defense, like EVs, and so are very critical. So we're very close. If you look at the broad critical mineral spectrum, China has more levers that they can pull with certainty. They have really only focused their export controls on specific defense niche critical minerals because they know that's the scariest stick that they have. They could do more. They could do more in the battery material and more general critical mineral spaces as well.
Yeah, I mean it's frightening, and there's no way we can also just go scour our sort of top drawers and find old iPhones and dig the stuff out, right? I mean the circular economy on these key elements hasn't been developed. It's incredibly hard and again very expensive, right? I mean that's also not an option.
We have several groups who are focused on the space, but you're exactly right. It is not at a commercial scale today. I'm hopeful the next 3 to 5 years brings us kind of a more circular economy in the permanent magnet space, but certainly not here today.
It's just sort of slightly terrifying, isn't it?
I know it really is. It's a very scary situation that we've backed ourselves into.
I mean, given that, is this sort of conversely or sort of perhaps perversely points to some optimism that actually neither side can truly risk an outright trade war, and that the connectivity between these economies today, and this goes, the same narrative around Taiwan, obviously, as it
Yep.
comes to chips. We've had economies have become so specialized in certain key areas of the supply chain that it is somewhat acting like a glue and stopping these things going too far, because presumably there are people in the administration saying, if this happens, then this, and this is what, that would be an extraordinarily difficult situation to be in terms of the broad economy, but also national security.
I would like to believe that that's true, and I do believe that that's true. For as many levers as China has at their disposal, and as many levers as they've already pulled, you do have to believe that they will stop short of an all-out just nuclear event within the world economy, right? And that's what export bans would lead to. And importantly, they're not just export banning the US, but they're also banning many allied countries so that we can't like backdoor receive these materials. And so, China builds things to sell to other countries. And yes, they are incredibly resilient and have a hell of a war chest in terms of being able to wait us out and take the long view. But I refuse to believe that they want to fully destroy all, kind of trade relations with other countries. Same thing with the US. I refuse to believe that that's the end game. I believe that rationality will emerge and things will revert to the mean. It's just quite a scary prospect in the interim when we're not sure of kind of short-term motivations.
Yeah, well, it's such a powerful lever that there is the danger for the US in particular that it's the one that becomes isolated, as Europe
Yes,
can't,
exactly.
can't risk not having trade relationships with China,
Yes,
and suddenly we've essentially sort of inverted the growing world consensus from a Western perspective over the last couple of decades.
it is a non-trivial concern and one that I am exceptionally worried about.
So, well, it's been fabulous having you on, and I guess just before is there? I imagine the commodities sector is going to be watching this story closely as part of geopolitical interest, but also geopolitical fact, which you've already mentioned sort of the heavy rare earths as probably being ground zero of some of this action. The lithium story, the cobalt, nickel, that's sort of, there is a different narrative. That's
It is.
tied to the energy transition, but also subject very much to battery chemistry, technological development. It's these sort of rare earths, these permanent magnets, where actually they aren't replaceable at the moment. Just, I guess, as you look over the next couple of years, what's one or two things we should be looking out for? What are the kind of the gates that seem very serious in this narrative? And is there one or two of those rare earths, you've mentioned the heavy rare earths, that are kind of emblematic and absolutely critical, and the ones that in some ways kind of lead the way and we should be paying particular attention to?
Yes, absolutely. So you're right. Battery materials, a little bit of a separate story today. I think the things we need to be very worried about are single point of failure supply chains. And unfortunately, on these niche defense critical minerals, they are basically all single point of failure supply chains. And that single point of failure is China. In addition to heavy rare earths, I am exceptionally concerned about materials like gallium and germanium, which are important to the semiconductor space as well as the defense space. Again, national competitiveness, national security. Extremely worried about materials like antimony and tungsten, similar applications. These are materials that aren't viewed as sexy or headline catching as maybe rare earths, but are every bit as critical to the US economy and US national security. If I had one message to leave folks with, It's don't only focus on the end products. And this call to action is specifically to capital allocators, but please focus on the entire supply chain. How do we make ourselves more competitive? How do we make ourselves more secure? And how do we ensure that we're insulating ourselves against future supply shocks? Because we do no one a service, certainly not American citizens, by only focusing on allocating capital to the Apples of the world, right? We need the entire supply chain.
Yes, well said. We need the commodities sector, and not just those liquid traded ones, but the entire mineral value chains to operate efficiently and effectively. And as you've outlined, when they don't operate in this case, it can have very scary consequences. We haven't even mentioned health, right, as well, and all the technologies that go into that.
Absolutely.
So it's key. But, well, Ashley, thanks so much for your time. It's been really great to connect and really great to have this discussion. I hope we can have you back on in a year or two, if you're not just unbelievably busy at that point, back in your investing life and leading SPACs and so forth. But love to have you back on, and hopefully there's some either progress on developing these supply chains, or better yet, we get back to a world where we can have countries maximizing their economic opportunity and all the rest of it that has led to a very successful and rich world in the interim.
I look forward to that date, Paul. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. It was really fun.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.